Hello there and welcome to my ultimate guide to the summoner in Shadowbringers. So I realized that this video is actually quite long, and so there are actually a bunch of different sections, and I have provided different timestamps out in the description below. Yeah, check that out, and then you can head to whatever section that you want and skip over anything else. This guide is made after the significant summoner rework changes seen in patch 5.1, and so anyone interested in getting the most up-to-date rotation and information is all set here. So this guide, I'm going to be covering the following topics: summoner niche, traits and overall fantasy, pet breakdown and abilities, pet bar fundamentals, Egi Commands And You, Titan versus Ifrit, and when and why it's kind of worth considering swapping between them. And then summoner ability breakdown, but we're going to first start off by going over some bookkeeping, such as what are global cooldowns, what are the off-global cooldown abilities, why do we have 4 different ruin spells, why 3 different bios, and where's miasma 2. Next up, we're going to go into damaging abilities, then we're going to go into trances, phoenixes, Bahamuts, and you. Next off, we're going to finish that section off with utility abilities. Then we're going to go into gear, stats, and testing your build, or how you can tell that your build's going to actually be able to do what you want it to do. And then we're going to go into openers and rotation, starting with a single target opener and rotation, and then some notes about the AOE Opener and Rotation, even though that's a bit strange to say, but we will go and explain that later. And then finally, we're going to cap off the entire video with a review, including my final personal rating and opinions. The Summoner is undeniably one of the most iconic jobs to ever exist in the Final Fantasy universe. The ability to evoke deities, powerful beasts of yore, and the like is such an incredible fantasy that it has absolutely captured the hearts of many, and Final Fantasy XIV Summoner has been through a lot over the past few expansions, having earned monikers of Disease Mage and Ruin Mage. But I can say after the patch 5.1 changes that we have seen in Shadowbringers, that the Summoner finally feels like a whole and complete summoner. Rotating between our ever-reliable lesser summons through Ifrit, Garuda, and Titan, all primals that were heavily involved into the lore of the actual game, into summoning Bahamut that was responsible for the Cataclysm after 1.0 into Realm Reborn, into even Phoenix with its own heart-wrenching lore. There is no denying that the summoner that we are at today has its gameplay intrinsically tied to the lore of Final Fantasy XIV, not to mention the raw power fantasy of having a massive Bahamut or Phoenix backing you up. Come at my Bahamut, bro. And that these two are going to be bathing the field in massive blue Akmorns, overflowing the field with phoenix feathers that heals allies, and bathing the field in fire, burning your enemies to ashes. That's not even getting into the storyline, where the storyline, I'm going to be honest, without giving spoilers, it's tied to some very significant characters in the lore, and I can say that the job questline is absolutely worth checking out, and I definitely liked it. But let's talk more about how it actually feels to play, and why you'd want to pick up the Summoner in the first place. The Summoner is a member of the magic range DPS category, and that's going to be getting some people very nervous because when people think about that, they tend to think about a very rooted down caster with massive cast bars. However, I can say beyond any shadow of a doubt that the Summoner is extremely high mobility. In fact, when playing it, you can opt to lower your damage a slight bit in order to become fully mobile when necessary. You might not be as mobile as a dancer or a bard, but you're absolutely going to be giving them a run for their money if I'm being quite honest. In terms of utility being brought to a party, the Summoner has a ridiculously wide pool of tools to help them and their team get through the fight. Being one of the only 2 DPS that has a combat revive, when you bring the Summoner to a team, you have an extra layer of protection on at all times. And protection is good. You also bring a powerful 5% team raid buff through Devotion, 700 potency heal over time through Everlasting Flight to help out healers, and on-demand damage mitigation through Addle. It takes little to say that if you want to play a DPS to bring some utility to the raid, the Summoner ranks very high up there. The rotation is also something that I can say is quite engaging. You go through multiple phases where you start with an opener focused on a particular Egi, pop into Dreadworm Trance, summon Bahamut, and then summon Phoenix, all the while maintaining your damage over time spells, weaving in pet skills, bursting the enemy down with the abilities like Fester, and I can say that the Summoner is absolutely one job where there's a lot to learn and a lot to grow with over time as you get more comfortable with it. The Summoner really allows you to expand and grow and learn and improve. It's something where as you gain comfort and experience, you will become an irreplaceable asset. But in order to become that irreplaceable asset, we need to start creating intuition on what the Summoner does and an understanding of how all the pieces go together. To do that, we need to start by talking about the now core part of the Summoner's kit, their pets. The Summoner has 3 basic summons, Titan, Garuda, and Ifrit. These form your baseline and will be what you use to fill in the time between Bahamut and Phoenix. Garuda is your AOE summon that you're going to be using mainly during large dungeon pulls. She's brought out using Summon 1. Titan is best known as the tank summon, but in reality, given his rework in Shadowbringers, he's probably best known as a self-preservation pet. You can bring out Titan using Summon 2. Ifrit is your go-to summon for any single target scenario focused on damage. You'll pull him out of the Aether during boss fights, raids, and trials. Spawn Ifrit using Summon 3. It should be noted that all of these pets can be summoned instantly and swapped at any time during content. in combat or out of combat. So if you want to swap from Ifrit to Titan when things go south and then back to Ifrit when things calm down mid-fight, that is more than applicable and actually something that I make an argument for doing later on. Now let's get into the details of how pets work, starting with the pet bar and basic pet actions. For the most part, you won't really need to worry too much about these commands, but I think quickly touching over what they can do can be helpful for anyone that's really new. If you're wanting just a quick boiled down version, leave the pet on steady or guard at all times. I personally go with guard. Place it near raid bosses to optimize the travel time of Ifrit in particular, and then use sick when you want to optimize Ifrit's auto attacks. Outside of that, I have never seriously considered any of these commands worth using, and it's actually something that as a HUD element I actually usually hide. Now to get into the details for anyone curious, Away will force the pet to leave the battlefield. I rarely find this useful myself and would rather just resummon a different pet or stop it from attacking using the next command. Heal, and heal is going to order the pet to follow behind you, but in other words it's going to just stop it from attacking the target. I actually make very little use out of this action as well. Place will move your pet to target destination, and this is an ability that I actually have a love-hate relationship. When you are truly wanting to optimize your damage, yes, placing Ifrit near the boss is very good, but in reality most of the time you aren't going to have the time to do it, or you aren't going to have the patience to do it, and it is definitely one of those things that is more of a micro optimization. Stay will make the pet stay where it is. Unfortunately, this is not something I use often at all. Steady will make your pet not attack anything unless you attack something specifically or use the stack command on the pet that forces the pet to attack a particular target whether you are attacking it yourself or not. Reality is I keep the pet set to this mode, or I keep it set to guard actually more often. Either of these two, you basically just leave it on. And then guard functions very similar to steady, but if anything attacks you, the pet is going to attack it even if you do not. I really don't find much of a use of this. Theoretically, this could be useful in a situation where you want to AFK farm, but the reality is that pets are far too weak to AFK farm and that they don't actually have their own HP bar or aggro, so in reality it's going to go after you if there's a mob, and that the mobs that would automatically attack you in combat are high level and very likely to crush you as a squishy summoner standing still. And the pet damage on its own is actually not that impressive to take down mobs. And finally, the sick command just forces the pet to attack the target outside of raid situations where you want to highly optimize your DPS and travel time of Ifrit. It could be a problem, but in my opinion this is not a command that you're going to be like, oh yeah, every AOE dungeon pull I'm going to use sick command, every dungeon boss I'm going to use sick. In reality it's just impractical for me to tell you you're going to do that. And then finally, as a recap of what I personally use, leave the pet on guard at all times, place it near raid bosses to optimize the travel time of Ifrit in particular, and then use sick when you want to optimize Ifrit's attacks. Outside of that, I really haven't considered any of these commands with any level of seriousness. And now let's get into the pet abilities that will make up the core part of your kit. The summoner has 3 ways to command the basic Garuda, Ifrit, and Titan pets: Egi Assault 1, Egi Assault 2, and Enkindle. The 2 Egi Assault abilities are on your global cooldown and act as standard instant cast spells. These abilities, however, can hold a maximum of 2 charges you can use at any time and recharge 1 charge of them every 30 seconds. Well, technically, this does scale with spell speed when you get a charge slightly faster than 30 seconds with more spell speed, but that should mostly be ignored and doesn't impact the rotation at all. In fact, I'll get into spell speed in more detail later in the stats section, but back to the 4 charges of these 2 abilities. This means that during the start of the fight you can use the 4 Egi Assaults in total at once, and then you only need to wait 30 seconds for another charge to come up. Lastly, we have Enkindle, that should be considered your pet's biggest, most powerful ability on a significantly longer cooldown of 2 minutes. However, one significant perk is that this is off of the global cooldown, unlike the other ones, and can be weaved between the other spells. If you ever heard the term off global cooldown and wonder what that is, that's just an ability that you can weave in between abilities on the default about 2.5 second cooldown timer, making it highly accessible to ram in there for extra damage. If you want more information on global cooldowns and what that is, I actually have a section of this video later on that if you want to jump to it, go to the timestamps in the description and that will explain all of that there. But now that we have established our 3 baseline abilities to interact with our pets, let's go over and translate what these all mean for each of the pets, because they actually act very differently. So Egi Assault 1 will make these pets use a particular special ability. For Ifrit, this is Crimson Cyclone, which is a powerful single target attack. For Garuda, this is an area effect burst of damage, and for Titan, it is a personal shield for the summoner. Already based on this, you can probably start to see that each pet has its own kind of niche. Next up is Egi Assault 2, that will make the pet use a particular different special ability. Ifrit, this is Flaming Crush, that is a powerful single target ability with a significantly weaker area of effect side effect. Garuda will use Slipstream that places a small circular area effect zone on the battlefield that damages any enemy that enters. For the record, if you use both charges of Slipstream, they do not stack. It will simply overwrite it. And Titan finally gets Mountain Buster that deals a solid amount of damage to all surrounding enemies that shockingly doesn't have fall off. Enkindle will make Ifrit use Inferno that deals a significant burst of damage, and then applies a damage over time effect which in total deals about 400 potency of damage. Garuda will strike all targets in a conal area of effect for 350 total damage. And then Titan is actually extremely similar to Ifrit, but instead of a conal AoE, it's a circular AoE comprising of an initial burst of damage, and then Titan places a damage over time circle on the ground, totaling for 400 potency for all enemies that stand in it. And so based on this, we can see that Ifrit is more effective in single target scenarios for its pure damage in raid situations, and you will almost always want to go with this pet in raids. Garuda is the de facto area of effect pet, and in dungeons you're going to want to ensure that you stay with this for large pulls. And Titan is very similar to Ifrit, but does exchange some of its offensive potential for a defensive shield. And that is actually the next section. Titan is a pet that has been called out much in the past for being suboptimal, but is it always? I know a lot of people will be brutally cynical with me here talking about Titan with an area of seriousness, but I do believe that there is a line to be drawn between when you use Titan and when you use Ifrit, and I want to argue that point here. For all intents and purposes, Enkindle is the same between Titan and Ifrit, and Mountain Buster for Titan deals 250 potency to all enemies around Titan, similar to how Ifrit deals 250 potency to the first target and then 50% for the rest of the targets around, making Titan have a slight edge in AoE. But we are mostly forced into single target aspect here since Garuda really does have AoE covered with a massive advantage over both Ifrit and Titan. So there are two differences between Titan and Ifrit. Firstly, Titan's basic attack Rotbuster is a 20 pet potency less than Ifrit's basic attack Burning Strike. While yes, this is a 25% increase of pet potency per auto attack, in actual gameplay that is not bleeding edge optimized, this is not the worst thing that can happen, and I still think it is a trade-off worth considering. When I ran the numbers myself, just letting Titan auto attack a striking dummy for 3 minutes resulted in a recorded DPS of 841.03. Letting Ifrit auto attack a striking dummy for 3 minutes resulted in a recorded DPS of 1156.21. So that results in a loss from auto attacks alone of 315.18 DPS. Secondly, your Egi Assault 1 ability will make Ifrit cast Crimson Cyclone hitting a single target for 250 potency. Now Titan, on the other hand, will give you 30% maximum HP shield, but due to the nature of Ruin 4 charges, this shield will actually not give you a Ruin 4 charge, and we will cover Ruin 4 later, but for now, you can basically think of that as 140 potency for free. And so you're going to be missing 2 Ruin 4 charges, so a total of 280 potency if you use both of the Egi Assaults on Titan. And so that is actually the actual crux of the argument here, is Egi Assault 1, what is your total loss from this? So I've let Ifrit auto attack on the striking dummy for 3 minutes, and I have used Egi Assault 1 on cooldown. This resulted in a total DPS of 1620.49. So subtracting 1156.21 from this results in 464.28 DPS being from Crimson Cyclone. So you are losing this much DPS from Egi Assault 1 Titan versus Ifrit. 315.18 from auto attack, and then from Egi Assault 464.28. which is a total of 779.46 for me. So what are we trading about 180 DPS for? The shield. So 30% maximum HP shield on a summoner with say 90k HP this patch will equate to about 27k HP shield. And I think it's worth keeping in mind that the Dark Knight, a tank, has a cooldown, the Blackest Night, that is raved about that gives them a 25% shield. Mind you, on a tank with significantly more HP this does go further, but the point is that people rave about the Blackest Night making the Dark Knight an amazing tank, and so it is worth keeping in mind when making a judgment about the Summoner's Titan pad. But I think another comparison that you should make is definitely to White Mage's Cure 2 with a cure potency of 700, heals for about 24k. My Benefic at 400 cure potency on Astrologian heals for roughly 14k. Disclaimer is that I am obviously not best in slot healer this patch, so your mileage may vary. So this means that each shield is roughly equal to having a personal cure to in yourself. Now keep in mind that you can hold 2 charges of Egi Assault 1, meaning that you can pop 30% shields on yourself twice in quick succession. For clarity's sake though, these shields do not stack up, and instead the duration of the shield is just brought up back to 30. So most people are probably rolling their eyes saying, okay, that's nice, but let's tie some aspects of the summoner together. We are one of the 2 DPS in the game that bring a battle revive, meaning that if both healers die, we can be responsible for bringing them back to life, and we are therefore able to actually continue to clear the content rather than have a full wipe. But during this time, there could be considerable damage going out, meaning that if you swap to 10 Egi and that you basically provide yourself with shields, that you will dramatically increase your potential to actually survive the counter. While one shield might be 27k HP, 2 is 54k, or 2 personal cure 2s, this can open up the chance for you to potentially even hardcast revive on a second healer, or maybe just survive the time when both healers are dead and you pop swift cast revive. Alternatively, Titan can also help offset the damage of tremendously heavy hitting mechanics aimed at particular DPS, saving healers some anxiety and strain. Although, given the raid DPS loss, I can't really recommend this all the time, so I think that probably the better argument is that the healers are ignoring you for whatever reason, or maybe they just don't care to heal you. But examples of situations where you do take quite considerable damage is things like Into Savage, where it has a Hellwind mechanic that will lower your HP to 1, and then you need to stand in puddle very quickly after this. If the healers aren't healing you, then the shield can ensure that you can stand in the puddle, not die, and that the party doesn't really wipe to the puddles. Another example includes Eden 1 Savage, where 2 DPS have a powerful bleed effect placed on them. Alexander 11 and Sigmascape 3 would target the DPS with a marker and slam them with a powerful missile and very potent damage over time that would, if not handled correctly, would cripple them as well. It is definitely a spicy damage over time effect. So even in Savage raiding, there are some great examples of mechanics to consider this on. And so, do I really think that Titan is going to be your go-to default best pet? No. But you know what? I think that it's definitely something you should consider, because it does make the summoner very resilient. And let's not forget though that you can change your summons instantly off the global cooldown freely. The only limitation is that you need to wait 3 seconds between pets. Personally, I'd say that it's always ideal to use Ifrit in a single target scenario and then rapidly swap to Titan when you see everything starting to crumble, but once you have revived the healers, swap back to Ifrit, meaning that the 700 DPS loss is truly not that realistic. You will not be on Titan for full 3 minutes of a fight, or you hopefully will not be. So I honestly think that Titan is being given a lot of bad reputation for not being an ideal DPS pet, and that is true, but when stuff goes south, and it does go south especially in pug parties, I can think of no better option than to quickly bring out Titan, shield yourself, and then go back to Ifrit later when things have calmed down. So now let's start talking about the summoner kit itself. I have officially covered pets in more than enough detail with that, and I think everyone fully understands what's going on there. And I really do want to talk about the core parts of your own kit as a summoner. First off, let's get some bookkeeping out of the way, because I do get a lot of questions about what is a global cooldown, what is a hard cast, and I definitely get an onslaught of questions about why do we have 4 different ruin spells. First off, Ruin 1 becomes Ruin 3 automatically as you level up. Ruin 1 is the exact same as Ruin 3 at max level. It takes up the same skill slot on your hotbar. This happens through a trait called Ruin Mastery. These are not separate skills, and this is just a damage potency increase. Bio 1, Bio 2, Bio 3 are the same ability. Very similar to Ruin 3, just being a higher potency version of Ruin 1. Bio 3 is, you can just think about as the final evolution of Bio 1, and it takes up the same skill on your hotbar. This happens through unlocking the Corruption Mastery trait. These are not separate skills, and this is just a damage potency increase. Miasma 1 is the same as Miasma 3. Same deal as Bio, and through the same Corruption Mastery trait. Likewise, these abilities share the same skill slot on your hotbar. These are, as you probably guessed, not separate skills and just a damage potency increase. Miasma 2 is actually not something that you worry about at all. That is a scholar thing, or it was, correcting myself, that was a scholar thing, and you do not need or have a Miasma 2 in any capacity. So the place where things start to become confusing for people is when we circle back to Ruin spells, where I intentionally didn't mention Ruin 2 or Ruin 4. Ruin 2 is its own distinct skill, very much separate from Ruin 1 and Ruin 3. Ruin 4 is a special activated higher damaging potency charge of Ruin 2. This is acquired through the enhanced Ruin 2 trait. It is for in all intents and purposes exactly the same as Ruin 2, but with an increased potency. Ruin 4 is when you gain a charge does take the same slot as Ruin 2. So you can essentially think of Ruin 4 as an enhanced Ruin 2, just deals more potency damage. It does not function differently in any other regard, just more damage. So when you run out of charges of Ruin 4, you can no longer cast Ruin 4s and you are back to basic normal damage Ruin 2. Just don't make it more complicated than that. I know that the names can get a little confusing for people. And so I will not be referring to Ruin 1, Bio 1, Bio 2, or Miasma 1 from this point forward, and only refer to their endgame equivalents. If this doesn't fully make sense, then I hope it does later when I explain these skills, and this is just something that I have actually been asked shockingly a lot by a lot of new and especially returning players, and so I really want to spend the minute of time to make it just super crystal clear. And if you're wondering why, Summoners and Scholars way back in the day used to be able to stack these damage over time effects separately, so returning players wonder why they can't stack 5 damage over time effects now. So they have all been merged basically. And then last off with bookkeeping before we actually get into the skills is a note about global cooldowns versus off global cooldowns, because these concepts are very core to the summoner. If you are already familiar with this, please feel free to skip this and go to the next section. There is a default 2.5 second timer between global cooldown abilities. This is impacted by spell speed and skill speed to be less than 2.5 seconds. For all intents and purposes, I will refer to it as 2.5 seconds for simplicity's sake. Spells on the global cooldown will trigger the default 2.5 second cooldown time between all skills on the global cooldown timer, meaning that you can't use any other global cooldown skills during this 2.5 second block of time. Off global cooldown timer skills are the exception to that rule, and they can be cast between global cooldown spells anytime you wish. The common literature is to call skills on the global cooldown spells and skills off of the global cooldown abilities. Using off global cooldown abilities between 2 global cooldown spells is commonly called weaving. To fit in 2 off global cooldown abilities between 2 global cooldown abilities is called double weaving, and the optimal summoner rotation is built upon a lot of double weaving, and while that might sound scary, it is really not all that bad once you do get the hang of it. Weaving is ideally done using instant cast spells on the global cooldown, which leaves you open to cast off global cooldown abilities freely during this open 2.5 seconds of time between your next global cooldown and the current one. Global cooldown spells with a cast time require you to focus on that cast time and are not going to allow you, generally speaking, to weave in off global cooldowns as you cast. The summoner doesn't have any reduced cast times. All the casted abilities on the summoner in particular are going to fill up that full global cooldown. This is frequently referred to as hard casting, when you dedicate an entire global cooldown to casting a single global cooldown spell. Lastly, the concept of clipping your global cooldown is when you are caught in an animation lock on an off global cooldown that prevents you from immediately casting your global cooldown on your natural 2.5 second cycle. So it might be 2.7 or 2.8 second cycles because you were animation locked. So with all of that cleared up, let's start talking about the abilities that make up the core of what you will cast. You can think of these as your most basic foundations of your rotation that everything builds up on top of. So starting off with our first basic filler spell, we have Ruin 3. With a basic 2.5 second base cast time on the global cooldown, this will deal moderate 200 potency damage. Ruin 2 is our second basic filler spell that is on the global cooldown as well, but it is instant cast and therefore can be used when moving and used to weave in off global cooldowns very smoothly. This comes at the cost of being 40 less potency than Ruin 3. However, Ruin 2 does make the summoner the most flexible caster, being able to deal with any mechanic without fully stopping at the slight damage decrease, and this is why the summoner is really mobile. Whenever you hear me talk about Ruin 3 in the rotation or anywhere going forward, you can always replace it with Ruin 2. You just have a slight 40 potency decrease in damage. You are still able to keep moving while casting. So always keep this in mind. You have the choice between running around and spamming Ruin 2 or using no abilities. And if you have to make this choice, spamming Ruin 2 is of course far preferable. And now let's talk about Ruin 4, and if you watched the last section, you heard me describe it as a special charge that you can obtain that simply upgrades Ruin 2's potency from 160 to 300. All other aspects of Ruin 2 remain intact. It is on the global cooldown, it is instant cast, and so it's great for mobility and weaving. This all remains true, and I don't take that back. But I didn't explain how you obtain Ruin 4 charges. Last section we did talk about in depth about pets and how they work, and how you have 2 abilities called Egi Assault 1 and Egi Assault 2. These command the pet to execute an action, but this actually does a full circle back to yourself and actually enhances your own rotation, as when the pet executes an offensive action from Egi Assault 1 or Egi Assault 2, such as Crimson Cyclone, you gain 1 charge of Ruin 4. The game likes to call this Further Ruin, but I like to think about it as just like loading a revolver with 4 charges, that essentially each Egi Assault is going to put 1 more cartridge into that revolver, and when you shoot out a Ruin 4, that's going to cause a lot of pain to the target, and is actually very, very core to your rotation we're going to go over later. This in essence makes Ruin 4 the absolute ideal weaving spell, because it hits harder than even your basic hard-casted Ruin 3 at 100 more potency. Next up, I want to talk about our 2 core damage over time abilities. Bio 3 is an instant cast spell on the global cooldown that will apply a damage over time effect, hitting the target for 50 potency every 30 seconds. This totals to 500 potency per Bio 3 cast over the entire 30-second duration. Remember that it is instant cast, so this does leave you with an opening to weave in spells. Miasma 3 is a 2.5 second cast time spell on the global cooldown that will hit the target for 50 initial damage over time for 30 seconds, hitting for 50 potency every 3 seconds, and so this is going to add up for a total potency of 550 on the target for 1 cast over the full duration. These combined together add up to a consistent 100 potency damage over time to the target every 3 seconds, and this should be maintained at all times because this is a very significant chunk of your damage. And lastly, I want to talk about the ability that makes the foundation of our AOE, Outburst. This deals a very humble 90 potency to a group of enemies. I know that number will seem low, but you need to remember in the context of the kit, it is actually significant, and it is a hard cast spell with a cast time of 2.5 seconds on the global cooldown. So now let's start talking about some of the off global cooldowns that we weave in. These actually section off into their own kind of categories really nicely, so I'm going to kind of follow the natural structure here. So let's talk about Aether Flow. This is one of the 2 summoner gauges and is here, and it's just these 2 diamonds here on this gauge. It shows how many charges of Aether Flow you have, up to a maximum of 2. Aether Flow can be thought of, continuing the kind of revolver metaphor as before, as putting in 2 cartridges into the revolver, expending them on extremely powerful abilities. There are 2 ways to obtain Aether Flow in-game that are very similar. Both Energy Drain and Energy Siphon are on the shared same 30-second cooldown timer and give you 2 stacks of Aether Flow. Energy Drain is a single target ability dealing 90 potency damage, and Energy Siphon is an area of effect version of that, dealing 40 potency damage to all enemies around. While yes, these numbers on their own, also similar to Outburst, do seem remarkably insignificant, do keep in mind that this is all off of the global cooldown and weavable. Now that you have 2 charges in your revolver of Aether Flow, now you can spend this on 2 different abilities. The first one is called Fester, and that is a single target ability, and the other is called Pain Flare, that is going to be the area of effect option. Pain Flare will simply deal a flat 130 potency damage to all enemies in an area. Fester is a bit more involved than Pain Flare and deals more damage to the target based upon how many damage over time effects applied to them. So if you have both Bio and Miasma on a target, Fester is going to deal a solid burst of 300 potency damage to the target. Our next off global cooldown set has to deal with damage over time management of Bio and Miasma. Try Disaster can be thought of as a method to cheat out Bio and Miasma without paying their costs, with the added benefit of being off of the global cooldown and with an additional 300 potency single target burst tied to it. Try Disaster is absolutely by far one of your most potent and worthwhile abilities to cast. With this, you skip the need to hard cast both Miasma 3 and Bio and maintain full mobility and save yourself 2 global cooldown casts of Bio 3 and Miasma 3. In fact, later on when we talk about the rotation, Try Disaster makes it so theoretically 75% of the time during a 2-minute rotation, Try Disaster is going to be all you use, and you aren't actually going to need to hardcast Bio or Miasma. Finally, we have Bane, that is going to spread your damage over time effects to all monsters around the target when they are spread around. So that's going to unfortunately deal a little bit reduced damage to these mobs that are impacted, but it's going to relieve you of a little bit of concern. So when you use Bane, Bane actually has a new quality of life increase where all of the mobs affected by the area of effect ability who got Bio and Miasma put on them, even though it is reduced damage, even if the timer on the first mob is only 10 seconds, all of the mobs around that are impacted are going to have the full 30 seconds duration of both Bio and Miasma, so you're not going to have to worry about that. On the flip side, it doesn't refresh dots on the target, so you aren't going to be able to, say, use Bane to refresh your dots like something like the Bard can do if you come from the Bard. Now we are actually on the coolest part of the kit. Let's talk about the big boys now. Tranches, Bahamut, and Phoenix. And while this might not make full sense until the end of the section, I like to think of the summoner's rotation as a circle, or I personally call it like the summoner life cycle that you go through. Sure, you have an opener, but overall you go through general phases of the circle here. First off, you start by entering the Dreadworm Trance ability, and you can think about this as the first gate to the big summons. Once you end Dreadworm Trance, you are now ready to summon Bahamut for 20 seconds. seconds. Once Bahamut has finished devastating the field, you now wait for Firebird Trance and bring out Phoenix for 20 seconds. And once Phoenix has roasted the field and disappears, you then are back to your downtime phase, waiting for Dreadworm Trance to come back again. Your Dreadworm Trance ability indicates what I'll call a position of 0 seconds in. Bahamut timing is something that I will talk about later in the rotation, but for the purposes of clarity and learning, I'm going to put him in at the 10 seconds mark. Bahamut lasts 20 seconds, and so this is going to in total bring you to the 30-second mark in the cycle. Now you have roughly 30 seconds more until you have Firebird Trance to summon Phoenix, and this is what we're going to call downtime phase number 1. You then enter Firebird Trance to bring out Phoenix for 20 seconds, and then you are back into downtime phase. Downtime phase number 2 in particular, until Dreadworm Trance is back up, and so you have roughly about 40 seconds here. And then you're going to be closing the loop with that Dreadworm Trance and forming the full circle of the summoner life cycle. Dreadworm Trance is your opener and can be thought of as the first gate that you open in order to unlock Bahamut and eventually Phoenix. Dreadworm Trance should be treated as something like Swift Cast or Triple Cast for black mages. Your spells have become instant cast for the duration of Dreadworm Trance, giving you a short burst of incredible mobility and weaving potential with no damage downside. The difference being is that at the end of Dreadworm Trance, that you can unleash a massive 400 potency Death Flare that also deals 200 potency to all enemies around the target, making it a very powerful damage utility as well, especially in AOE situations. So in essence, if you are caught in a situation where you have Dreadworm Trance up and you want to avoid a lot of mechanics and jump around, this is going to make all of your Ruin 3 spells instant cast and Outburst spells instant cast, and even be useful in making Miasma 3 instant cast when reapplying dots. Although we are going to be covering in the rotation that this is not actually going to be something that you're going to be doing, because you do need to really account later on for lining up your heavy hitting combos with raid buffs, but we will cover that later. So now let's talk about why I call this the gate to Bahamut. So as soon as you use Death Flare, you actually have exited the Dreadworm Trance phase, and please don't forget to use Death Flare because I see a lot of people do this. I have even done this in the past, and it's not going to like automatically trigger at the end of the Dreadworm Trance for you, so make sure to use it. But if you look at the tooltip of Dreadworm Trance, it'll talk about 2 units of Dreadworm Aether and whatever else. Ignore this because it's overcomplicated. I don't even know if you can possibly get 1 unit of Dreadworm Aether. I think that this might just be legacy stuff from how Summoner used to be, but just think about this as you have finally unlocked the gate to Bahamut. Bahamut being unlocked is going to be indicated by the gauge with Bahamut on it turning blue and flashing. So now there is actually going to be a lot going on when you first press the Bahamut button, and I want to go over each component of that very carefully here because I have talked to a few players and it has overwhelmed them initially. So first off, you have Bahamut for a total of 20 seconds until he goes away on his own, and these effects are going to remain in place until that point in time. First off, your normal basic summon of Garuda, Ifrit, or Titan disappears. You lose access to your basic pet actions, so no more Egi Assault 1 or Egi Assault 2 or Enkindle. This may seem very weird, but you actually have a completely distinct, completely separate button for Enkindle Bahamut. Yes, it says Enkindle on it as well, but you're going to want to ensure that this is kept on your hotbars separately, because normal Enkindle will not be replaced by this when Bahamut is summoned. This will order Bahamut to execute their massive potency Akmorn ability, deals a hilariously devastating 650 potency to target and 325 potency to all targets around it, making it a devastating and very worthwhile AoE. And it is on a very fantastic 10-second cooldown timer, and due to the 20-second duration of Bahamut, this means that you get 2 Enkindles when you have Bahamut out during a single Bahamut summon. Now people are going to ask, is that really all? Not quite. When Bahamut is summoned, every single cast of Ruin 3, Ruin 2, or Ruin 4, or Outburst will make Bahamut attack alongside you with something called Worm Wave, or in other terms, any global cooldown ability that you use will make Bahamut use Worm Wave. Off global cooldown abilities will not make Bahamut execute Worm Wave, but Worm Wave is going to deal 150 potency damage to the target that you attacked, and if you are using Outburst, this however is not going to make it become an area of effect Worm Wave, and it is only going to hit the one main target that you're targeting with the Outburst ability. This makes Bahamut a very significant DPS increase and can be thought of as a massive boost to the potency of your foundational Ruin spells. During this 20-second window that Bahamut is out, it is very critical to time your global cooldowns to activate Worm Waves and weave in Akmorns in an ideal order to maximize damage output. But that is more for the rotation section, but just a heads up. In an ideal world, you will fit in 8 Worm Waves with 8 global cooldowns. After Bahamut has reached the 20-second duration mark and disappears, it is finally time to bring up Phoenix using Firebird Trance. Firebird Trance is on the exact same button as Dreadworm Trance. Once Bahamut has been summoned and disappears, Dreadworm Trance is fully replaced by Phoenix Trance. This shares the same cooldown as Dreadworm Trance that begun when you initially activated Dreadworm Trance, and so this should be about at the 30-second mark or so by the time Bahamut flies off. Popping Firebird Trance is very similar to summoning Bahamut. Phoenix is summoned for 20 seconds, your basic Garuda, Ifrit, or Titan goes away, your Egi Assaults go away, and your basic Enkindle goes away. Similar to Bahamut, your Enkindle Bahamut skill now becomes an Enkindle Phoenix skill. This will make Phoenix execute the ability Revelation that will deal an insane 650 potency to one target and 325 potency to all enemies around it, making Phoenix's AoE very powerful, very similar to Akmoran. This is also on a short 10-second cooldown timer, so you are going to be fitting in 2 of these during the duration of Phoenix. And then also similar to Bahamut, all of your global cooldown spells will make Phoenix execute an ability called Scarlet Flame that adds an additional 150 potency to all of them. But you do get actually a lot more perks on top of those with Phoenix. When Phoenix is summoned, it triggers a 100 HP over time effect onto allies that lasts 21 seconds. This in total heals each party member for 700 potency. And while this isn't something that you will be holding on for like stack mechanics or raid-wide AoE damage due to like the duration and how your rotation just generally goes, this does, however, act as a good heal over time effect that can actually help out the party members. Again, though, this is not really your goal of your kit, and it's just kind of like a nice tack on, but again, don't worry about timing it. But probably more specific and more important to Phoenix specifically is that it's going to change your Ruin 3 spell and your Outburst spell into direct Phoenix commands. These commands become a part of a 1-2 rotation for Phoenix that you should be able to get 4 of these rotations fit into the entire duration of Phoenix. First off, Ruin 3 becomes Fountain of Fire, and it makes Phoenix hit the target for 250 potency. It is single target though, I should clarify that. The nice added perk is that Fountain of Fire is instant cast and thus allows full mobility and weaving. This is a solid upgrade up from Ruin 3's 200 potency, but the real benefit here is in the second part of the 1-2 rotation. Outburst becomes Brand of Purgatory, and like Fountain of Fire, is instant cast, and so weaving and mobility is absolutely a thing here. Brand of Purgatory also deals a whopping 350 damage to the first enemy, and then 175 damage to all surrounding enemies, which is a dramatic increase in damage potential from Outburst's very humble 90 potency that we covered in the beginning. But if we add up these two effects that are 250 potency and 350 potency over 2 global cooldowns, and then look at Ruin 4 that deals 300 potency, we are basically spamming Ruin 4 8 times during Phoenix Trance while weaving in bursts of Revelation. So there is no denying that during a large dungeon pull, when I pull out Phoenix though, I just bathe the field in fire and wreck everything. It's actually kind of hilarious if I'm being honest. And so finally, once those 20 seconds are up, Phoenix disappears, and then you are back to your default normal mode, waiting for the next cycle of Dreadworm Trance to open the gate to Bahamut that will unlock Firebird Trance again. So revisiting that circle from before, we can now see how we've made a complete loop around the summoner life cycle, and that we can see from here that we just cycle over and over again in 2-minute loops. Summoners aren't just useful through their glorious pets and damage though. Summoners bring with them extremely powerful utility that any group would want. First off, let's start with Resurrection. This ability alone puts the summoner on a completely different platform of utility than any other job in the game, bar Red Mage. Only Red Mage and Summoner can revive, and when you are progressing through content or participating in a raid, or maybe even just basic expert roulette and something goes wrong with the healer, being able to revive a healer is such a great tool. It cannot be understated. Bar none, if you don't care about any other utility, this one is a game changer, and I can say from personal experience that I always feel more comfortable knowing that a Red Mage or Summoner is in the same party as me, even if I am playing a Bard or a Scholar or a tank. I just appreciate that extra layer of confidence that if both healers or one healer goes down, then we can come back from it in some way. Maybe not the most graceful way, but a summoner can even hardcast revive if their swift cast is down. Now let's talk about boosting the party's damage, and the Astrologian in me is currently eating their heart out on this one. Summoners get the ability Aether Pack that makes the pet execute the Devotion ability. This gives all allies a flat 5% damage buff for 15 seconds every 180 seconds, without weaving and micromanaging cards. As I said before, the Astrologian in me is crying right now. And there is no denying though that this this is going to add a decent chunk of damage to any raid group and is a more than welcome buff. Now let's talk about Adel. After years of learning to weave this in with Bahamut to make Bahamut execute more Wormwave, it is nice to finally see that we can actually use it as utility to reduce raid-wide AoE damage, so now Summoner can help in that area. No doubt this is welcome during things like Eden 2 Savage, Trip Quietus phase, or any Savage AoE raid-wide damage. And now we come to something that I'm going to need to explain a little bit, because most people that are new to Summoner end up asking me this question. And so when you scroll over the list of skills, you're going to exclaim about having a heal. This is called Physic. And initially, even I myself was excited to potentially retest it and see, hey, does this finally scale? When I tried the new summer changes in patch 5.1. The fact is it doesn't scale properly. It is based off of the old mind stat for healers versus intelligence system for damage. So it isn't scaling with intelligence like Red Mage's Vercure, meaning that this heals for an absolutely pitiful amount. To me, I really wish that the development team would actually let us have Physic back in functional form. There are too many situations I've been in where I would like to have had the ability to self-heal myself to make up for a tank failing or a healer ignoring me. Heck, even raise the MP cost to be obscenely high. Like currently, if we look at Red Mage's Vercure, they're at 500 per Vercure at 350 potency. So when they're doing both Vercures, that is 100 MP for 700 potency of healing. I'd personally say that I'd be fine to make Summoner have Physic at 400 potency for 1000 MP to prevent spamming. But unfortunately, while this is absolutely in their spellbook, I can't say that this is utility. And so let's hope that the developers here are polite and make this something that actually scales within. But overall, in Summer, you have an extremely useful and very welcome utility across the board. I mean, by a little, you have the #1 utility of Resurrection, but you know what I mean. 10 out of 10 for utility for sure. So let's talk about gear, stats, and testing your build. Before we get into any rotation, these are all very critical things to keep in mind when you are playing the Summoner, and that you have a set number of goals that you want to achieve in each phase in order to determine if you either have or have not prepared. So let's start with testing your build. The litmus test to see if you are able to do the rotations are going to be #1 is that you need to be able to get off 8 Wormwave during Bahamut and 2 Akmorn. I'll talk about this later during the rotation section. This comprises of 3 hard casts of Ruin 3, 4 instant casts of Ruin 4, and 1 swift cast of Ruin 3, or alternatively swapping that out for a Ruin 2 cast. That might seem like a lot of jargon not knowing the rotation, but the core is that you need to fit 8 Wormwaves. Secondly, you need to be able to fit in 4 rotations of Phoenix Fountain of Fire to Brand of Purgatory rotations. And next off, to just make sure that you are finely tuned enough, you need to fit in 8 Phoenix Scarlet Flames without clipping off the last Scarlet Flame. You really need to make sure that you get all 8 in. But likewise, your real concern is going to be mostly the Akmorn and Wormwave rotation and making sure that you get 8 in there. If you can get 8 in there, you should be able to get 8 in with Phoenix. And if for any reason any of these 3 are not possible, then really consider increasing spell speed on your build and slotting in more materia for that. But this is really going to be dependent more on what is your latency and how long does it take for the server to actually get your message and process it. Spell speed is our worst stat by far, and in fact the optimal best in slot build provided by Summoner expert Nemec has no spell speed at all on any of the gear, including materia. Some reasoning behind this is that when we went over the Summoner skills, how many of them actually involved a cast time? We had Ruin 3, Outburst, Miasma 3, where Miasma 3, 75% of the time, you're going to actually be cheating out the damage over a time effect with Try Disaster. So not even really that. And all of these cast times are only about 2.5 seconds long, so not even that bad at all. We're on the Black Mage, spell speed is king, and it just doesn't have a place on the whimsical, bouncy, and very mobile Summoner. In terms of stats, you're going to want to maximize crit above all else. Then direct hit is roughly better than to equal than determination, but I personally recommend direct hit over determination. I just like direct hit crits a lot. And then the best food recommended to me was robe lettuce salad, and so this is going to actually increase both determination and crit. The cheaper alternative that I'd personally recommend for those on a budget is Espresso Con Pan that is going to raise direct hit and critical hit rate. Now if you want more information on best in slot, stats, breakpoints, and the rest, please head over to akmorning.com and consult the fantastic documentation that Nemec has created. But I want to kind of go over why I talked about spell speed and 8 Akmorns before. So in terms of spell speed, this is why the test is so critical to try out, because different players have different varying amounts of latency and the rest, that you want to see exactly how far you can push everything, but you at the same point in time want to be reasonable and be like, oh, okay, I can fit in 8 Wormwave. So if you aren't getting in 8 Wormwave, then it is time to consider more spell speed. While yes, the highest theoretical DPS does exist with no spell speed and a perfect 2.5 second global cooldown in practice, if you can't fit in all of the necessary pieces into your opener and rotation, you're going to be much worse off for it, unfortunately. And so having a little more direct hit or a little more determination is vastly inferior to getting off that 8th worm wave. So now let's talk about openers and rotations. Single target rotation is our first rotation. So I want to have kind of a note, because I really was going through this section. I was talking to some of my friends new to Summoner who were trying it out, and openers and rotations in general seem to be a scary thing for a lot of newer players, and that's just from what I've experienced talking to them. And I think in terms of CR rotations at a glance, the Summoner is going to look absolutely off the rails bonkers to many new players I've talked to, but I think given everything, that once you develop a solid intuition of the foundations covered earlier and when and why things go together, that starts to make a lot of sense, and it does become very natural over time. I'm actually speaking from experience on that, because even I had to get myself updated with this rotation. So things to keep in mind are that the Summoner goes through their Summoner life cycle of phases, going from Dreadworm Trance to summoning Bahamut to their first downtime period number 1, then Firebird Trance, and then finally ending the loop with downtime period 2 that closes the circle by activating Dreadworm Trance again. This general concept and idea is the framework that we're going to be going off of and building from here. At the heart of this, you're summoning absolutely awesome Bahamuts and Phoenixes. Credits for the full rotation go to the Balance Discord and Elevation, Ada Starkbane, Fright Avarice, Namek Kinryu, Tsundara, Moto, and akmorning.com. There are a few very minor deviations from the suggested rotation I personally make sometimes, but I will be sure to point them out. Also, before we get into it, having higher spell speed and your global cooldown being lower than 2.5 will slightly move the exact state of the rotation a bit, like how many Rune 3s or Rune 2s you can cast, but the timings and number of skills are actually built around this 2.5 second global cooldown. So if you do notice that the number of runes you get is slightly off, then just adjust the fine details of casting them around it, or maybe let a little bit of breather room in if you really cannot fit in another, but just tinker with it a bit. Regardless of spell speed or anything else, the core cooldowns and indicators of each phase transition are the timings of your damage over time effects. Make those your anchor points. This is because Bio and Miasma have a 30-second duration to them. That way these will be placed in your rotation in a way that makes them the perfect indicators for raid buff timings. Raid buffs tend to come in 60-second increments of 60 seconds, 120 seconds, and 80-second cycles. 80-second cycles being even your own devotion raid buff. So adhering to your dots and making them your anchor to tell where you're at is going to become consistent. These 60-second increments should align with Bahamut and Phoenix. When in doubt, let the dots guide you. And then the last thing I want to say before we actually get into the rotation is that there is a lot of Rune 3 being casted here. However, if you are in a mechanic heavy phase or you feel unconfident about the mechanic or hard casting Rune 3, instead go down to Rune 2. Taking a 40 potency hit is always better than being dead. In fact, one of the major perks of being a summoner is having the ability to go full mobile, so when in doubt, take that minor hit to DPS. So to begin, we aren't even entering the summoner life cycle yet. It is important that we establish a solid entry point before the circle in our opener. Before we begin the fight, since we're in single target mode, we're going to have Ifrit Egi out as our baseline summon. Ifrit is unfortunately a melee range pet, so to circumvent this annoyance, place him manually near the target. This will reduce the delay in him executing actions because he's not going to have to walk up to the boss. In the suggested rotation, they advise you to hit Sick on the pet at the same time as you're casting your Rune 3. I personally prefer to just have Ifrit right at the boss already and ignore the travel time concerns completely. Again though, that's just going to be a stylistic preference. So to develop an intuition, every section I want to kind of go over what we have on our plate right now, what's on our agenda. Before the pull, we have a few things ready to launch out that we want to be cramming out as fast as possible. First off, we want to apply the damage over time effects to the boss. We do this with Pry Disaster. Next off, we want to get 2 stacks of Aetherflow and trigger the 30-second cooldown of our energy drain so that it is up sooner rather than later, and so we aren't losing damage to it just having it on rest. Thirdly, we have 4 charges of the various Egi assault abilities. We want to always ensure that we have them charging so that we aren't losing damage to it resting there, similar to energy drain. Remember though that you can't use the basic pet skills when you have summoned Bahamut or Phoenix, so try and make sure that you aren't going to have 2 charges cap midway through Bahamut, for instance, because you will be losing damage there. Fourthly, we have our pet's big Enkindle attack with a solid 2-minute cooldown timer begging to be released. Fifthly, we have Devotion that we want to push out to buff the entire raid's damage and our own. Lastly, we of course want to enter our Dreadworm Trance phase and start our Summoner life cycle. So as you can tell, we have a lot to process and all of it is a priority. So now that we're in this opener phase outside of the life cycle circle, but mandatory for a proper opener, we're going to first start off by casting Rune 3 and hitting the sick button to make our pet attack the target at the same time. Remember though, in my instance, I do always place the pet beside, so this is just an extra thing to just make sure like pet is attacking at the same time. And this should be much less of a delay because you place the pet near the boss nearby. You now follow up with Egi Assault 1, making Ifrit hit Crimson Cyclone on the target, following up immediately off the global cooldown with Energy Drain and Try Disaster, starting that 30-second Energy Drain cooldown and applying those ever essential dots. Next GCD, you're going to push out Egi Assault 2 and Ifrit uses a Flaming Crush ability. During this time, if you're in Savage content, pull out an intelligence enhancing consumable like Grade 2 Tincture of Intelligence. But this is pretty high-end content that I don't see very justifiable outside of Savage or Ultimate rating, so for most people, feel more than free to skip this. Third global cooldown is here, and then you pop your second charge of Egi Assault 1 for Crimson Cyclone. Follow up with Devotion, which lines up your personal raid buff with everyone else's, and then enter the Summoner life cycle with Dreadworm Trance. So at this point, we have officially entered the Summoner life cycle at the Dreadworm Trance period. Now you might have caught on, we entered Dreadworm Trance, but we still have 1 charge left of Egi Assault 2, and that is exactly what we're going to be getting rid of first. We're on our 4th GCD in Dreadworm Trance, and we immediately follow up with Egi Assault 2. This might surprise people new to the Summoner wondering why we might not be using our Instant Caster Rune 3, but the meaning of this is to clear out all of your Egi Assault charges because we really don't want them to come back during Bahamut, where we can't use Egi Assault abilities. And because during Bahamut we really desperately want all 4 charges of Rune 4 ready to be launched for extra potency damage, and more importantly, instant cast weaving. Another reason about this and why we have it at this point in time particularly is that there is a delay in pets executing Egi Assault abilities, and if the pet doesn't execute it before you summon Bahamut, remember Bahamut or Phoenix will completely replace your pet, and this means essentially that the ability is what we call ghosted and it basically disappears. So your charge of Egi Assault doesn't hit, you don't get the Rune 4 for it, and then you're like, oh no. And so yeah, you're going to be placing all of these this soon. But after this global cooldown that we're currently on, you want to see 2 abilities to weave here. I personally disagree with throwing Lucid Dreaming here because all it does is restore MP now, and it doesn't cut down enmity or deal damage or anything that we really care about right in this moment. So to personally cut down on mental clutter and busyness, I personally ignore this in my opinion. I cannot recommend double weaving this if you don't need to. Use Lucid Dreaming whenever the next open weave is, in my opinion, which is after global cooldown 8, and honestly your MP in my experience should be more than fine waiting. But what you do need to cast over this global cooldown is Enkindle, and it's really critical that you cast it now rather than your next global cooldown, because as I said before, once you summon Bahamut, your pet goes bye-bye, and you need to ensure that Enkindle gets off. So after this 4th global cooldown, make sure you're hitting Enkindle. Now we're on our 5th global cooldown. Cast Rune 3 instantly, which allows you to then weave Infester and Try Disaster. So this was something that even I myself asked in the past, why Try Disaster here? Fact is, Try Disaster carries 1,000 potency of damage over time through Bio 3 and Miasma 3, and then an additional 300 potency of damage. That's a lot, right? But we did just cast Try Disaster earlier, so we technically don't need to refresh our dots, so why not save it for later? The reasoning is that raid buffs are at an all-time high at this point. That 1,300 potency of damage being amplified by those buffs is extremely worth the trade-off of having to hardcast Bio Miasma later. As you can see in the infographic here, this gives them the Trick Attack Amplification, Chain Stratagem buff, Battle Litany, and a whole pack of other boosts. But as I said at the start, your dots are your anchor, and so from this point you have now established a precedent that now we are starting our 30-second timer at the same time as the raid buffs, meaning that every 60 seconds as you refresh your dots, you're gonna know raid buffs are gonna line for 60-second mark, 120-second mark, and 180 mark, and then you can go forward with confidence that's gonna line up from there. These become very much your anchor, and I cannot emphasize that enough. So carrying on, we are now on our 6th global cooldown. Cast Rune 3 instantly, and now we weave into our biggest phase change. We cut Dreadworm Trance early by using Death's Flare, and bring out Bahamut all between the 6th and 7th global cooldowns. We have now entered the Bahamut phase of the summoner life cycle, and Bahamut phase features its own highly specific rotation. Before we talk about that, why do we cut Dreadworm Trance early? Reasoning behind this is now we are aligned with raid buffs, and Bahamut is such a massive increase in damage that you don't care about the spell speed increase with Dreadworm Trance. You casting spells instantly is not going to deal more damage than Bahamut, so you're going to cut that off early and be like, okay, let's bring out our biggest damage now. So now let's talk in detail about the Bahamut phase. So a few things about it. First off, you want to fit in 8 global cooldowns in 20 seconds. 5 of these are strongly advised to be instant cast. Whether this is Rune 4, Rune 2, or Swift Cast Rune 3, 5 of them have to be instant cast in order to make this cutoff point. Second of all, there needs to be instant cast spells used in there in order to weave Akmorn in twice, which is Bahamut's Enkindle move. Third of all, it is advised that you enter this phase with 4 Rune 4 charges ready to fire off, simply because yes, you could use Rune 2, but you gain 140 potency with Rune 4. So now let's really talk about some substitutions that you consider in this phase. While you do come in holding Fester charges, these can still be allowed to slide a tiny bit, especially if you aren't really confident Double Weaver. Focus on the 8 global cooldowns, and if you have a place to throw in Festers, do so. If you follow this guide, it will be after GCD 7 or GCD 8. As seen here, we have some empty windows before the next energy drain. Second of all, if you don't have 4 Rune 4 charges saved up for Bahamut's Worm Waves, then cast Rune 2. It's far better than missing a Worm Wave. Making that 8 GCD cutoff is very tight as it is, and so if you need to make the transition, don't bother hard casting Rune 3, you won't make it. And then finally, if you want to save Swift Cast for a revive because you're in a party that you're not really confident with, then please do not use Swift Cast Rune 3 suggested here. It is only a 40 potency loss here, and sure, in numerical optimization world, that does matter in a raid or progression party, where healers can and do die though. I personally say that a lot of the time it is worth considering the 40 potency loss in my opinion. These rules stick for every single Bahamut rotation that you're going to ever do, so if you're struggling to fit them in, go back to the gear section and try and figure out a better spell speed or best in slot setup that matches your ping latency, and just adhere to these rules. So first thing in the Bahamut phase is that you cast a Rune 4 and then weave in a Fester and Akmorn. This is the first of 2 Akmorns, so be ready for that coming up in 10 seconds. Follow up by either using a Rune 4 or hard casting 2 Rune 3s. The order here truly doesn't matter, but in general a 1 Rune 4, 2 Rune 3 is kind of advised. Now cast a Rune 4 and then lead into your second Akmorn. Follow up with a hard cast Rune 3 and then cast Rune 4 and weave in Energy Drain at this point. At this point you choose, do you want the extra 40 potency or the potential Swift Cast later in the fight? If you want the 40 extra potency, double weave in Swift Cast here and then cast Rune 3 again. Otherwise cast Rune 2. Follow up with Fester ideally, but reality is that you can let Fester leak into the downtime phase a bit if you want to focus on getting this Bahamut phase down correctly. The only raid buff that it aligns with at this point is Tincture, and if that isn't something that you're using and you're not in like Savage or Extreme content or using that potion, then letting it slide or not isn't really a priority because you don't have any reason to care. Then with that, Bahamut phase is now closed and you are in downtime phase number 1. And so there are a few things to keep in mind going into this phase just to develop an intuition on what's going on. Firstly, your damage over time effects are going to be dropping off relatively soon, since Tri-Disaster was just reapplied before Bahamut to enhance it with raid buffs, so you will want to hardcast both Bio 3 and Miasma 3 on the global cooldown shortly after Bahamut leaves the field. You don't have Tri-Disaster at this point to cheat it out. Secondly, you're going to be getting 1 charge of both Egi Assault 1 and 2 soon. Thirdly, you will want to save at least 1 single Rune 4 cast to weave in the next phase, which is going to bring in Firebird Trance. This is because you want to weave in Firebird Trance, and you really don't want to risk clipping your Egi Assault by weaving in through there, and so I actually really want to make that clear. Never ever use Egi Assault abilities before Bahamut or Phoenix. I cannot stress this enough because they get clipped and then you lose it, so never ever. So now in this phase, following these things stated, you're going to want to cast 1 Rune 3 after Bahamut leaves. Then you want to reapply your dots on your GCD manually, ideally popping your second Fester after Bio 3 reapplication to make it line up with your Intelligence Potion buff. But again, if you don't have Intelligence Potion, it's all good. So So now prepare to spam Hardcast Ruin 3 while using 1 charge of Egi Assault 1 and Egi Assault 2. Near the end of the cycle you almost have Phoenix ready, but Firebird Trance being off cooldown does not mean that this first downtime phase is over. This is actually a very big trap, and you're gonna probably ask why. This might go against your instinct to see the massive Phoenix cooldown open up and not go into it, but a short delay actually is a really good thing, as this lets Phoenix exist on a closer to 60-second cooldown cycle. Remember, you want to really get those cycles lined up with the raid buffs. Firebird Trance and Dreadworm Trance both share the trait of being an imperfect 55-second cooldown timer. So just because you see it up doesn't mean that you will line up with raid buffs, as most raid buffs follow 60, 120, or 180 second cooldown cycles. At the start of this rotation section, I talked about anchor points to tell you when to enter the next phase. The anchor point between the transition between downtime phase 1 and Firebird Trance is that your hard-casted dots will expire and they need to be reapplied by Tri-Disaster that is now off of cooldown. What this is just following that 30-second duration timer that we were talking about before. However, before this anchor point, you are going to have some work to do. Egi Assault 1 and Egi Assault 2 will come off of cooldown a second time, as will Energy Drain. Pair Egi Assault 1 with 1 weave of Energy Drain as soon as Energy Drain is off cooldown. Do not cast Fester yet with Energy Drain, hold these for Phoenix phase because this is going to align with raid buffs. Wait until your dots are almost expired and then use Egi Assault 2, weave in Tri-Disaster. Now cast Ruin 4 and weave in Phoenix Trance. And now we are in the Phoenix phase of the Summoner life cycle. There is not too much to explain here, fortunately, compared to the rest, because it is very straightforward. You will want to get off 4 full 1-2 rotations of Fountain of Fire into Brand of Purgatory while weaving in Revelation and Fester as quickly as you can. During this phase, you'll actually have another chance to use Energy Drain, so cast it and get Aether Flow back, and then pop Fester while still under Phoenix Trance to get every ounce of raid buff juice out of it. So now we are in downtime phase number 2, and this is very similar to the last one, and expect Egi Assaults to come back, but this one is a touch different. This time when dots fall off, you have access to Tri-Disaster, so weave that in alongside Fester and when the Egi Assault abilities are finished. This saves you 2 GCD that could be used to pump out more Ruin 3s. But this phase does pose a problem. You can only hold a maximum of 4 Ruin stacks, and that wasn't really something that we were too worried about before because we were just blowing them so quickly. So as you are using Egi Assault abilities, do in the time before casting them, throw in a few Ruin 4, because you're going to be getting a higher potency because Ruin 4 is higher potency than Ruin 3. But always remember that you are going to be wanting to go into the next Dreadworm Trance with 4 Ruin 4 stacks. As soon as Dreadworm Trance is off cooldown, pop it, and then we enter into a very quick 3 global cooldown cycle, blowing us through getting Enkindle back and burning through the pet action. And this is going to lead into us going into Bahamut just like the first time, with a Ruin 3 instant cast weaving in Death Flare into Bahamut himself. From this point on, the cycle continues exactly as described here. You're going to want to pop Energy Drains when applicable though, and your Devotion raid buff later on is actually going to come off cooldown immediately prior to Phoenix, and so you're going to want to pair that between one of the Egi Assaults. And yeah, that was a lot, but I really wanted to explain the intuition and the rationale behind it, because a lot of the people that tried to show the opener 2 actually got really confused and they didn't really understand the stuff. Heck, I didn't understand some of the stuff until I started asking some of the experts, but you know what, I really wanted to go into detail with this because as soon as you develop an intuition, it's like, oh okay, this actually makes sense. So while that might seem like a lot, I can guarantee you if you develop an intuition on what goes where and more critically why it does, then I think that you'll see a massive improvement with practice and that things will start to feel natural over time. And as always, if you ever need extra resources to try and improve on, then always feel free to ask me or go onto the Balance Discord or acmorning.com. There are tons of people more than willing to help. So now let's talk about Area of Effect and kind of what abilities you have there and kind of try and assemble a rotation. And this one can get extremely dicey and complicated if you look at making an extremely optimized rotation. Consulting some of the experts on the Balance Discord, they confirmed my suspicions that in terms of AoE, it's more of a priority-based system based upon what you have at that time. Such as what point of the life cycle you're on will really determine what you'll have benefits-wise, such as Phoenix will likewise be exceptionally powerful dump of AoE damage, Bahamut will be considerably less so, but in any AoE situation, you're going to want Garuda out at all times as your baseline summon. As kind of a reminder, Garuda's Egi Assault 2 ability Slipstream does place a puddle on the ground that deals damage over 9 seconds. This does not stack if you use both charges on Slipstream, so that's definitely something to keep in mind, and keep the charges separate. And in any AoE situation, your baseline ability is going to be Outburst spam, and so that's going to be the long hard cast Outburst spam. You don't really have any instant cast equivalent equivalent to weave in, and this is going to be generally what you default to if you have nothing else to cast priority wise. And here I want to talk about priorities in depth and clipping your GCD of Outburst for things like putting out Bahamut's Akamorn. Ultimately, outside of pet abilities, we don't really have any really effective way to weave in global cooldowns in AoE. In personal experience, clipping the GCD has resulted in better numbers than if I try and weave in a single target ruin and then trigger the full 2.5 second GCD just for a single target burst of damage. On the flip side, if the pack of mobs that you're on is only say 5 or so, then I'd absolutely start weaving in Ruin 4 when you need to weave in something, especially if you need to double weave something like Try Disaster and Pain Flare. But if you're on like 20 or 15 mobs, then you're really not going to want to do that because you're going to be losing a lot of potency. Swift cast also isn't the most practical option here because you only have one swift cast per minute, and it doesn't really make up for all the weaving that you need to do. But if you do need breathing room or need to double weave something like Energy Siphon and then something like Pain Flare or any of your off-global cooldown AoE abilities, then that is an option that you have. So as a theoretical AoE rotation that you might get off once at the start of a dungeon when everything is up, just kind of as an example, usually before we arrive to the pack of mobs, I'd already cast Devotion because I want that buff out there, as I don't like the potential delay of cramming Devotion in between global cooldowns and hoping Garuda actually casts it early enough for me to actually reap the benefits of it. So when I start out with a pack of mobs, I tend to like to start by having Garuda use Egi Assault 2 to get that puddle out, and then Energy Siphon and Try Disaster to get the initial dots out and trigger the cooldown of Energy Siphon early on. An Egi Assault 1 into Bane that spreads the dots, and then the first charge of Pain Flare. I then use another Egi Assault 1, not 2 though, because again the AoE field Garuda drops doesn't overlap, and that leads into me using Enkindle. By this point I activate Dreadworm Trance and cast Egi Assault 2 for the second puddle, weaving in Pain Flare charge number 2, Outburst on the GCD immediately into Death Flare. At this point things are very different than single target based Bahamut rotation, because hitting only one enemy during a large pull with Wormwave is pretty lame if I'm being honest. So just keep casting Outburst when Akamorn is ready, just let that rip between Outburst casts, intentionally clipping your global cooldown with this just to push it in. But like I said before, if you are down to like 5 mobs, then weaving it in, I can actually see definitely a lot of reason for that because you're not losing that much potency while not clipping. From here you are in the first downtime phase before Firebird Trance. Continue to weave in Egi Assaults while minding to not use Egi Assault 2 a second time until after 9 seconds have passed from the first. When your dots are ready to be refreshed, follow up with Try Disaster and Bane. When Energy Siphon is ready, use it and weave in Pain Flares between instant casts like Egi Assaults. When Firebird Trance starts, then focus on rotating Fountain of Fire into Brand of Purgatory and unleashing Revelation between. Refreshing dots with Try Disaster and Bane is necessary, and Energy Siphon with Pain Flares. Now the question might be, what about Ruin Forecast? Personally, I use this for when there are only little stragglers left and use it to basically hammer them into the ground. Likewise, if there are only a few stragglers left, I will absolutely play into Dreadworm Trance if I'm in it and get 8 rune spells in there to get 8 Akamorns off. In terms of AoE, if you want me to be honest, you really just try and do the best you have given the constraints of what phase you're in and what is off cooldown. So trying to make it always have the 4 charges of Egi Assault and Enkindle up is just not realistic in many situations at all. So at the end of the day, prioritize things as you can and weave them in. And now that is all I have to say for the Summoner. As I read the script and scratch my head wondering just how long is recording and editing this beast of a document going to take, that's all I have to say. But in review, the Summoner is an extremely powerful magic DPS class that by every right brings forth extremely powerful party utility that makes them an asset in any group that they join. So let's talk about the pros. When you have a Summoner in the party with Resurrection, that is like having a writ of if anything hits the ground and eats dirt, at least you have one final last-ditch effort of recovering. Not to mention raid buffs through Devotion and protection through Adel are always welcome additions. But the Summoner in and of itself is no joke in the damage department. Absolute bleeding edge summoners are capable of dealing extremely high damage on both single target and AoE scenarios. And best yet, the summoner does this all while being extremely mobile. The summoner also poises itself as a challenge to players, that they can have an extremely high skill ceiling when it comes to their rotation and properly weaving in abilities and maintaining a rotation perfectly aligned with raid buffs and potions. And success at doing so at the time of writing this guide makes them the literal top DPS in the entire game. They have a severely engaging rotation that will make players wanting a challenge extremely happy. So now let's be real with the cons, because the summoner does unfortunately definitely have a few of these, but one really sticks out. So the first con is the biggest and probably the number one thing that puts players off of the summoner in the first place, and why this guide is so ridiculously long, because I look at the time as I'm recording this and wow, I don't even know what to say. Wow. People look at the rotation, they look at the pieces of all of the kit, they look at the phases, they look at the multitude of off-global cooldown abilities and go, wow, I'm just going red mage because at least that makes sense to me. If you are looking for a class that is very easy to pilot, I cannot recommend the Summoner to you. This is one of the most punishing classes in the game, and after playing each and every single job at max level, I am not joking and I'm not exaggerating, I have found Summoner by far the most difficult. And sure, melee DPS like Monk, I had to learn those positionals and get used to that too. Yes, positioning yourself during mechanics in melee is very difficult, but you can take a small potency hit or use True North to bypass that, and if there's a mechanic where you aren't expected to actually be in melee position, then anyone expecting you to go and die to that is just being silly. I'm not saying Monk is easy, of course, but playing it has a much more clear flow and feel in my experience, and the rotation I find much more direct. In the opposite direction, Black Mage is difficult in a much different sense. With Black Mage, you use your mobility tools, and if you lose track of what you do to move around, then you're going to get punished. It's more about positioning and mobility rather than actual rotation, because even just looking at the difference between the Black Mage single target and AOE rotation, it is very streamlined and very defined. I don't find that we have many phase transitions with the Black Mage. I feel that it is very set in stone what you do. And with Summoner on the other side, if you let your cooldown slide or forget to cast Death Flare or try Disaster, you're going to be in quite the try disaster, alright. Heck, even during the rotation, when you see the Firebird Trance skill come up to use Phoenix, if you immediately mash that button, go, ooh, big button shiny, then you failed the rotation. So if you're not ready to practice at a training dummy and accept that you can and will fail for a few days, if not a few weeks of Summoner, then it will be very disappointing to you. And I definitely have had a lot of friends throw their hands up in the air and say, I am not dealing with all this, I'm just going red mage, the damage is not that much less. So that is definitely a con. Next off, I want to talk about how Titan Egi's Earthen Armor ability doesn't give you a stack of Rune 4. I can accept the potency decreases on the rest, but you know what, the lack of Rune 4 really kind of seals the deal for Titan Egi not being viable replacement for Ifrit. Yes, I did make an argument about, yes, the shield is useful and I stand by that, but you know what, the DPS decrease by losing Rune 4 as well as the rest is very painful, and I don't know why Titan's shield has to be the one single ability that can't give you Rune 4 stack. I would love to see that. And lastly, physics scaling with Mind still is really disappointing, and I'd love to see it scaling with Int. Perhaps a significant bump to its MP cost to 1000 or something would be necessary to balance it out, but we have already seen Cure on the Red Mage be relatively successful, and we haven't seen Red Mage with a far higher cure potency potential be a massive problem. But in summary, I actually love the Summoner. When I play it, I always feel like, hey, I'm bringing a lot of utility, I'm bringing a lot of damage, I'm constantly engaged when I play it, and I actually personally do like that. Keeping in mind the con that if it is not for you, then that's totally okay. That is like, you gotta enjoy what you're personally doing. And for me though, I do love the Summoner, and it's something that I would recommend a lot of people to give a try. Like, I definitely think even if the rotation does at first look intimidating to you, just go back and then learn some of the intuition, learn what all the pieces do, then put it together and like give it a real shot, because I actually was intimidated at first. I will admit that when I was first looking at it myself, I was intimidated. I'm like, oh my god, what the heck's going on here? But after practicing with it over and over again on a striking dummy, after talking to some of the experts, after learning the intuition, after really thinking about it for a while and making this guide, I was like, oh wow, this actually makes a lot of sense, and this is actually really engaging and really fun. So definitely something that I can recommend, and I personally love it. So what are your thoughts on the Summoner? I know that this guide, if you made it to the end, thank you, I really appreciate it. But what are your thoughts on the Summoner? Is it something that you're looking to play, or maybe you already play it and you really love it, or maybe you've given it a shot and it didn't quite work out for you? So let me know in the comments down below, because I am actually genuinely really interested to hear and do read like all of the comments that I get my way. And so yeah, let me know. Anyhow, that is all for this video, and god, I'm recording right now and I am looking at that time and I am thinking, this is gonna take me a week to edit. Oh no. Help, send help, and Hrothgar.